Have you ever sacrificed so much to be present for someone only to arrive and be treated like trash? 9 hours. In a storm so fierce I could barely see the road. But I kept going, telling myself she'd be happy I came, that a mother's love still mattered. When I finally stepped through the door, drenched and trembling, she looked at me like a stranger and said, "You weren't invited." My world did not just fall apart that day. Something broke in me. This isn't just a story about a birthday. It's about what it means to be forgotten by the one you gave everything to. If you've ever shown up for someone and they never appreciated it, stay with me. But before we continue, hit the subscribe button for more real stories about love, loss, and finding your voice again. The rain had been falling for hours, thick, angry sheets that turned the highway into a blur of black and silver. My hands ached from gripping the steering wheel so tightly, knuckles white as bone. But I kept driving. My eyes, dry and stinging, darted between the road ahead and the clock on the dashboard. The wipers screeched rhythmically, struggling to keep up with the storm, but I didn't slow down. I told myself it would all be worth it. This was my daughter's birthday, her 30th, a milestone. One I didn't want to miss, not after everything, not after the silence. The calls that went unanswered, the texts that got one-word replies. I convinced myself she was just busy. That motherhood had swallowed her whole the way it once did me. That maybe, just maybe, she'd be happy to see her mother show up. Uninvited, yes, but not unloving. I'd made her favorite lemon chiffon cake, the same one I used to bake when she was little. It sat in a container on the passenger seat, carefully covered with a cloth so the cold wouldn't harden the glaze. My overnight bag was in the trunk, along with a cardigan I'd started knitting for her 3 years ago, but never had the heart to finish. I brought it anyway. I don't know what I expected when I turned onto her street. Applause? A warm hug? A surprised gasp? The truth is, I didn't really expect anything. I just hoped. That was my first mistake. Her house looked different now. New windows, new siding, a different color on the door. The porch light was on, soft yellow spilling into the night, and voices echoed from inside, laughter, music, the faint clinking of glasses. I parked 2 houses down and walked the rest of the way, shielding the cake under my coat like it was a newborn. I hesitated for a moment at the door, adjusting my soaked sweater, patting my hair back into place. My heart beat against my ribs like it was trying to warn me. But I rang the doorbell anyway. It took longer than I expected for someone to answer. I heard footsteps, laughter fading, then the door creaked open. And there she was, my daughter, my only child. The little girl I once carried through fevers and heartbreaks and nightmares. The one I hadn't held in my arms in over a year. Her face, when she saw me, didn't light up. It didn't soften. It didn't even flicker with surprise. It just froze. Her mouth parted, but no words came. For a second, we stood there, just blinking at each other, me, drenched from head to toe, clutching that damn cake like a peace offering, and her, standing in the warm light, party in full swing behind her, strangers chatting on her couch. Then she said it. You weren't invited." Her voice was low, quiet. Maybe she thought that made it easier to swallow. Like if she said it gently, I wouldn't feel it crack down the middle of my chest. Like a soft knife doesn't still cut deep. I looked back at her and tried to smile, tried to save whatever dignity I had left. I thought maybe you'd want me here." She hesitated, then shrugged, as if that explained everything. I felt the sting then, not just of rejection, but of years, decades. I had changed her diapers. I had taught her how to tie her shoes, sat up with her through heartbreak, clapped the loudest at every school play. And now here I was, dripping water onto her doormat, reduced to a stranger outside her life's celebration. The lemon chiffon cake slid slightly in my arms. I caught it, steadied it, and nodded. "Okay," I said quietly. "I understand." But I didn't. Not really. Not yet. I only knew that I needed to get off that porch before my knees gave out, before she saw the way my face was about to crumble. So I turned and walked back into the storm. The rain hadn't let up. If anything, it fell harder now, like the sky itself had something to grieve. I didn't run. I couldn't. My legs moved stiffly, as if weighed down by all the years I had spent loving her without condition. Each step away from that porch felt like trying to walk through water, the kind that pulls at your ankles and doesn't want to let you go. I reached the car, opened the door with shaking hands, and slid inside, dropping the cake onto the passenger seat. The lid had loosened. A smear of yellow glaze had bled onto the edge of the container. I stared at it for a long time. My beautiful cake, the one I made with such care, now ruined in all the wrong ways. I sat there, soaked and stunned, the door half open, rain blowing in, the storm louder than it had been all evening. The laughter from her house echoed faintly down the street. It felt distant now, like it belonged to another life, another woman. Maybe it did. Maybe the mother she remembered, or wanted, was someone else entirely. Not me. Not the woman in the driver's seat of an aging sedan with damp sleeves and a too soft heart. I didn't cry. I thought I would. I'd imagined that moment before, reuniting with her after so long, maybe even an apology tucked in there somewhere. But what I got instead was something worse than anger or cruelty. It was indifference. That quiet, casual dismissal. You weren't invited. Like I was an inconvenience. Like my love was an unspoken obligation she never asked for. I closed the car door, the thud of it sealing me off from everything behind it. The world inside the car was colder, smaller, safer. I pulled out my phone, not sure what I meant to do. Call someone, check into a hotel, just stare at the blank screen. But no one would be waiting on the other end. Not anymore. My sister had passed 2 winters ago. My old friends had long drifted away, most of them growing tired of the way I always declined invitations or left early to be there for my daughter. Always for her. Even when she moved out and rarely called. Even when she forgot holidays, forgot to ask about my health, forgot me entirely. I still showed up. Like tonight. And now I didn't even know where to go. The city wasn't mine. The streets felt unfamiliar, like I'd aged out of the life I used to belong to. I started the engine and drove without a destination. I passed gas stations lit in harsh white, restaurants full of strangers, and cheap motels that blinked their vacancy signs like a heartbeat. My hands shook on the steering wheel, the cold finally creeping in deep enough to reach the bone. Eventually, I pulled into a roadside inn, the kind with faded curtains and carpet that smells faintly of old smoke and bleach. The man at the front desk didn't ask questions, just handed me a key with a number scratched into the tag, barely glancing at my face. Room 204 was small and plain. A single lamp on the nightstand cast a weak yellow glow, the kind of light that makes everything look older than it is. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall for a long time. Not thinking. Just existing. Just trying to remember how it felt to be someone worth inviting. I opened the cake container, still sitting in my lap. The top was dented now, one edge of the frosting smudged, but it smelled like childhood. Like birthdays when she used to beg for the fluffy lemon one, her face lighting up the moment she saw it. She'd always have 2 slices, always ask for more the next morning with her tea. I made that cake every year, even after she left home, even after she stopped showing up for her own celebrations. The room was silent, save for the hum of the heater and the quiet thud of rain against the window. My daughter's face kept replaying in my mind, not angry, not cruel, just blank, unmoved, as if I were no more than a passerby who had wandered into the wrong house. And that was what hurt most. Not that she didn't want me there, but that it didn't even seem to matter. I lay awake long into the night, hands curled against my chest, the ache inside me growing louder than the storm outside. I didn't sleep. Not really. I drifted in and out, caught between dreams that weren't dreams at all, just memories replaying on loop. Old birthdays, old voices, the clatter of dishes, the soft hum of my daughter's laughter when she was little. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw her again, standing in that doorway, eyes dull, arms crossed, mouth forming the words that wouldn't stop echoing. You weren't invited. At some point in the early morning, the rain stopped. The silence felt unnatural after hours of endless noise. It wasn't peace, it was absence. Like the world had run out of ways to distract me from the truth. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the dark had softened, and a faint bluish light filtered through the motel curtains. I sat up slowly, the stiff ache in my joints reminding me that time had passed, though I couldn't say how much. The cake was still on the table, untouched. The cloth I'd used to cover it was damp around the edges, and the glaze had begun to sink slightly into the surface. It looked tired, like me. Too much effort for too little joy. I got dressed in silence, moving mechanically. Shirt, sweater, jeans. The same ones I'd worn yesterday, still a little damp at the hems. I brushed my hair in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. Her eyes were too quiet. Her mouth didn't know how to smile without forcing it. I picked up my phone again, just to check. No new messages, no missed calls. I didn't know what I was hoping for. Maybe a text from my daughter, something simple like, "Sorry, Mom. I didn't mean it." But there was nothing. She hadn't even noticed I was gone. I thought about going back. Not to her house, I wouldn't humiliate myself again, but back to my own city. Back to my own life, as small and solitary as it was. But the thought of sitting in that quiet apartment, folding laundry and watering plants like nothing had happened, made my stomach turn. Something had happened. Something had broken. I walked out of the room without touching the cake, left it sitting there like a question I no longer had the strength to answer. The motel clerk nodded at me as I handed back the key. I didn't say a word. The air outside was heavy with dampness, the streets glistening with leftover rain. My car smelled like old lemons and faint disappointment. I started driving without knowing where I was going, passing neighborhoods I'd never seen before. People walking dogs, sipping coffee on porches, going about their lives as if love didn't falter, as if mothers didn't stand alone in doorways holding cakes no one wanted. Eventually, I pulled into a small park. Empty, cold, but peaceful in a way that felt honest. I sat on a bench near a swing set, watching the wind push a single plastic seat back and forth like a pendulum. It creaked every time it swung. I closed my eyes and listened. I'd given everything to her. My time, my energy, my body, my dreams. When her father left, I didn't. When we couldn't afford much, I still found ways to give her the world: secondhand costumes, homemade gifts, storybooks read by flashlight when the power went out. And she loved me. Back then, she did. But somewhere along the way, that love turned into something else. Something conditional. Something curated. Something polite. And now she stood in doorways and said you weren't invited. Like I was a neighbor with poor timing. Not the woman who once held her through every fevered night. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the cold to settle into my bones. Long enough for the sun to break through the clouds and cast soft golden light across the playground. Long enough to realize I couldn't go back to who I was before that doorstep. That mother was gone. I drove until the gaslight blinked on. I stopped at a gas station just off the highway, the kind that smelled of burnt coffee and oil-stained concrete. A teenage attendant gave me a half-hearted nod as I pulled up. I filled the tank slowly, watching the numbers climb with that strange detachment that comes after a long fall. Inside the convenience store, the overhead lights were too bright. Rows of candy bars, instant noodles, postcards no one ever bought. I wandered through them like I was looking for something, but I didn't know what. Maybe I just needed to feel like I had a purpose, even if it was just choosing a bottle of water or a pack of gum. At the counter, I noticed a small rack of greeting cards tucked behind the lottery tickets. Most were generic, covered in glittery fonts and watercolor flowers. One stood out, plain, cream-colored, with a sketch of a woman's back. Her shoulders were bare, hair pulled up in a loose knot. No text, just the image. I picked it up and stared at it for a long time. The woman reminded me of someone I used to be. Someone soft, unguarded, quietly hopeful. I turned it over and bought it without knowing why. Back in the car, I didn't start the engine. I just sat there with the card in my lap, the silence around me growing heavier with each breath. I thought about what I would write if I had the courage. Maybe not to my daughter. Maybe to myself. You were there. You always were. Even when no one noticed. Even when no one thanked you. I thought about all the versions of myself I had folded down, tucked away, dismissed. The woman who loved art before she became a mother. The one who used to sing in the kitchen while baking. The girl who once dreamed of traveling alone. Where had she gone? The answer was simple. She'd been sacrificed at the altar of motherhood, of loyalty, of trying to be enough. And for what? A closed door. A sentence carved into her chest like stone. You weren't invited. The pain of that moment was still sharp. But beneath it, something else was stirring. Something that almost felt like resolve. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't have a grand plan or a clear path. But I knew one thing. I couldn't keep showing up in people's lives as an afterthought. I couldn't keep handing them pieces of me, hoping one day they'd look up and finally see the whole. It was time to stop waiting to be welcomed. I started the car again, turned onto the highway, and headed home, not back to the apartment I left behind, but to something deeper. Some part of myself I hadn't visited in years. I passed the exit to my daughter's neighborhood and didn't slow down. I didn't look back. It was almost noon when I reached the outskirts of my town. The clouds had cleared completely, the kind of blue sky that felt too honest to hide under. I pulled into the driveway of my apartment building and sat for a moment, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. My hands rested on the wheel, fingers still clutching it tighter than they needed to. There were no birthday balloons here, no music, no crowd of unfamiliar faces, just quiet. But somehow, that quiet felt kinder. I brought the card inside, set it on the kitchen counter, and stared at it. Then, slowly, I picked up a pen. I didn't sign it. I didn't address it. I just wrote one sentence. You're allowed to choose yourself. And for the first time in years, I believed it. The apartment felt smaller than I remembered. The silence hummed around me. No footsteps overhead, no laughter behind a door. Just the old refrigerator buzzing and the faint creak of pipes settling behind the walls. I used to hate this silence. I used to fill it with noise, TV reruns, radio talk shows, podcasts that never ended. Anything to drown out the loneliness. But today, the quiet didn't feel like punishment. It felt like space. I walked to the bathroom and caught my reflection again. The same woman from the motel mirror stared back, but something had shifted. Her eyes weren't so empty now, They looked like they'd seen something raw, something real, something final. I kept thinking about the card. That image of the woman with her back turned, bare shoulders exposed, strong in her silence. That card had nothing to do with birthdays or family or celebration. It was a quiet kind of grief, a goodbye without flowers. And yet I couldn't stop staring at it. I'd bought it on instinct. Maybe because some part of me had known what I needed to say. To myself. To her. To the version of me I kept locked behind other people's expectations. The truth is, I'd been holding on to my daughter in pieces. In memories. In what-ifs. In the stories I told myself to justify her distance. I'd spent years weaving excuses for her. She's busy, she's tired, she's going through a rough patch. But that night, standing in her doorway with rain dripping off my sleeves and a cake she never asked for, it unraveled everything. There were no more justifications left. I wasn't invited. That wasn't a mistake. That was her truth. And now, I needed to find mine. A part of me wanted to call her. Not to apologize, God. No. But just to hear her voice. To see if she regretted anything. But I didn't. I knew better. I knew how that call would go. There would be silence. Then that same careful voice, dipped in courtesy, not love. She'd say, "I didn't mean it like that, Mom." Or worse, "You're overreacting." Number I wouldn't beg to be seen anymore. I wouldn't shrink myself just to fit into whatever neat little box she'd drawn around me. The day moved slowly, stretching across the walls like soft light through fog. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't reach for a book. I just let myself feel it. The rejection, the shame, the quiet fury of being erased. It hurt. It burned in places I hadn't touched in years. But beneath that pain, I felt something stronger building, like muscle after a break, knitting itself back together, like breath finally reaching the bottom of my lungs. Late that afternoon, I opened the window and let the fresh air in. It smelled like damp pavement and clean beginnings. I sat by the sill, watching the sky shift from gold to gray, and whispered into the fading light. No more. Not to her. Not to anyone. No more shrinking. No more silence. No more pretending that love, in its coldest form, was still love. And somewhere inside me, the woman I used to be, the one who sang while she cooked, who painted sunflowers on scrap paper just to feel joy, she stirred. Not ready to dance. Not yet. But ready, at last, to rise. That night, I didn't turn off the lights. I lay in bed with the bedside lamp still glowing, soft and golden, casting a faint halo onto the ceiling. I wasn't afraid of the dark. No, not after everything. But I didn't want to be alone with it. I didn't want the silence to grow teeth and crawl into the corners of my thoughts. So I left the light on, like a small gesture of defiance. Like a woman saying, "I'm still here." Sleep didn't come easily. My body was tired, but my mind kept circling the same ache. The kind that doesn't howl or scream, but whispers. Over and over. A gentle repetition of all the things I could have done differently. All the things I thought I'd done right. All the places where the thread slipped through my fingers, and the fabric of my relationship with her began to quietly unravel. I thought about the birthdays when she was small, how she used to run barefoot through the kitchen, frosting on her nose, singing songs she made up as she went. I remembered the way she clung to my waist when she was afraid of thunderstorms, and how I'd whisper stories into her hair to make the world feel safe again. How did we get here? I whispered into the dark, not expecting an answer, just needing the question to exist outside my chest for once. The room stayed quiet. The ache deepened, not a sharp pain, but something dull and wide. A tired grief. Not for the loss of her affection, but for the slow realization that what I'd believed was love had been obligation. Performed. Convenient. Something to display when others were watching. Never messy. Never hard. Always tidy. Filtered. Manageable. I had allowed myself to become a background character in my own life, always waiting in the wings, always ready to step in and help, always told to be grateful for the small roles I was given. Mother, supporter, giver. And now, I wasn't even that anymore. I reached over to the small wooden box on my nightstand. Inside were old photographs, faded prints, some curling at the corners. I hadn't looked at them in years. I pulled one out. My daughter, maybe 5 years old, wearing a crooked birthday crown made of paper. Her cheeks were flushed, her smile crooked. I was in the background, just behind the cake, half out of frame, but unmistakably there. My hands were reaching forward, steadying the plate before she blew out the candles. I held the photo for a long time. What they never tell you about motherhood is how much of it you spend unseen. How much of yourself you pour into others without expecting to be remembered for it. You do it because you love them. Because it feels right. Because it's the kind of love that doesn't need applause. Until one day, you look around and realize you've vanished entirely. And worse, you taught them how to erase you. I set the photo back in the box and closed the lid gently. I wasn't sure what healing would look like. I didn't know how long it would take or what it would cost. But I knew this. I couldn't keep standing outside other people's joy with a gift in my hand and sorrow in my chest. I couldn't keep arriving uninvited. If they didn't open the door, I would build one myself. And it would lead inward. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't beg the past to look softer in the morning. I didn't pray for apologies or imagine a future where my daughter suddenly remembered who I was. I simply lay there, bathed in the soft light of my own presence. And I let that be enough. Morning came quietly, without fanfare. No birdsong, no golden light spilling dramatically through the windows, just a pale gray dawn pressing gently against the curtains. I opened my eyes slowly, unsure for a moment of where I was. Then it all came rushing back, not like a wave, but like a low tide exposing everything I'd tried to keep buried. The empty doorway, her eyes, the words. You weren't invited. I stayed in bed longer than usual. Not out of exhaustion, but because I wasn't sure what to do next. I felt like I was hovering between two lives, one that had just ended without ceremony, and another that hadn't quite begun. I stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of my own breath, and realized something painful in its simplicity. I didn't know who I was without her. For 30 years, I had revolved around her like the moon, always there, always steady, always reflecting back the light she needed. I had rearranged my world 100 times over to make space for hers. And now that she had drawn the boundary in sharp, final lines, I was left standing on the outside, not as a mother, not as a guest, but as something else entirely. Maybe just a woman. I finally got up and padded barefoot to the kitchen. The floors were cold, but I didn't mind. I moved slowly, deliberately, boiling water, steeping tea, peeling an orange with the kind of attention I used to give to everything except myself. I sat at the table with the card still resting on the counter, its quiet message staring back at me. You're allowed to choose yourself. I read those words again and again, like a chant, like a lifeline. I thought about all the things I'd stopped doing, the hobbies I gave up, the invitations I turned down, the friends I let drift away because I couldn't bear to talk about how lonely motherhood had become. I used to paint, nothing grand, just watercolors of flowers and city streets. I used to journal, used to dance in the living room when a favorite song came on. I used to hum to myself while I cooked, adding spices without measuring, trusting my hands. I couldn't remember the last time I'd done any of those things. It wasn't just her who had forgotten me. I had forgotten myself. I walked over to the linen closet and pulled down a box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were old art supplies, brushes stiff with dried paint, tubes curled and half-used, a pad of thick yellowed paper. I sat on the floor and stared at them for a long time. Then quietly, I pulled out a brush and rinsed it under warm water, scraping away the years, softening the bristles. There was no music, no poetry to the moment. Just a woman on a kitchen floor, holding a brush and trying to remember what it felt like to create something for no one but herself. I set up a small corner near the window, just a chair, the pad, and a single jar of water. I didn't know what I was painting. I didn't care. My hand moved slowly, cautiously, until color began to bloom on the page. Pale blues and muted violets. Nothing dramatic, nothing bold, but it was mine. As I painted, tears came, not the kind that rack your body, but the quiet kind. The kind that feel like a release, a soft morning, for the woman I used to be, for the mother who kept showing up, for the girl inside me who had stopped asking for more. I didn't paint her face. I didn't need to. The grief had already shaped itself into color. By the time I stopped, the morning had passed. Light was streaming through the window now, soft and warm. My hands were stained with pigment. My heart, for the first time in days, felt less heavy. Maybe this was the beginning, not of something dramatic, not of revenge or redemption, but of a slow return to myself. Not the mother, not the afterthought, just the woman, still standing, still worthy, still here. The apartment felt different now. Not warmer, not louder, just less hollow, as if something long dormant had stirred inside these walls. The silence was still here, but it no longer pressed on my chest the way it used to. It was a companion now, a witness. I made myself a proper meal, nothing elaborate, but something I would have considered a luxury before. Roasted sweet potatoes, a soft poached egg, toast brushed with olive oil and cracked pepper. I plated it like I was feeding someone I loved. And for once, I realized I was. As I ate, I thought about how many meals I'd served without ever sitting down. How many times I'd stood over a sink, eating scraps from pans while everyone else enjoyed what I'd prepared. I used to say I didn't mind, that I liked it that way. But now I knew the truth. I just got used to not being cared for. I trained myself to believe I didn't need it. The worst kind of neglect isn't loud. It's the kind you agree to, the kind you mistake for strength. I washed my dishes slowly, hands moving through the water like muscle memory. Somewhere deep inside, the words from that night still echoed. You weren't invited. And I realized it wasn't just that she hadn't included me in the party. She hadn't included me in her life for a long, long time. It had been small at first. The calls that got shorter. The visits that felt rehearsed. The shift in her voice whenever I said something that didn't align with the image she'd created of herself. As if I reminded her of something she didn't want to see. Or someone she was trying not to become. And I let her drift. I told myself I didn't want to be overbearing, didn't want to cling. I gave her space, time, freedom. I gave, and when she offered less and less, I adjusted my expectations like a woman learning to live on less oxygen. But that night, seeing her home full of people, strangers who knew nothing about me, who laughed and poured drinks while I stood in the rain holding a cake made with hands that once held her through every fevered night, that was when I finally saw it. I was no longer someone she wanted to claim. And it wasn't about perfection. I wasn't perfect. God knows I made my share of mistakes. I lost my patience. I yelled sometimes when I should have listened. I tried too hard to protect her from pain and ended up teaching her that love meant control. I saw it too late, like all mothers do. But I loved her with everything I had. I still do. The thing is, love doesn't always mean belonging. I walked to my bookshelf and pulled out a journal I hadn't touched in years. The spine cracked slightly as I opened it. The first few pages were full of old entries, lists, hopes, fears, grocery notes tangled with confessions. I flipped to a blank page, picked up a pen, and wrote the date in the corner. Then I began. Not a letter to her, not an explanation, just a sentence. Today, I chose myself. The next morning, I woke before the sun. Not from restlessness, not from grief, but because for the first time in a long while, I simply wanted to. The stillness before dawn felt like a clean page, and I didn't want to miss it. I moved quietly through the apartment, not out of habit, but out of reverence. The world hadn't stirred yet. The street below was empty, the sky a pale lavender, and even the birds hadn't started singing. It felt sacred somehow, like this moment was mine and mine alone. I brewed coffee slowly, the smell curling through the air like a promise. Then I sat by the window with my journal in my lap and the painting from the day before still resting nearby. The colors had dried deeper overnight, darkening into something even more solemn and tender. It looked like the underside of a healing wound. I touched the corner of the page, then flipped open my journal. Today, I choose myself again. The sentence came easier this time. Not like a statement, but like a rhythm I was learning to follow. My hands still trembled a little, but it wasn't from fear. It was the ache of a body slowly remembering how to reach for something it had long convinced itself it didn't deserve. I spent the morning quietly, folding towels, sweeping the floor, watering the plants on my windowsill. Mundane things, ordinary. But they felt different now, because I wasn't doing them for anyone else. Not out of obligation, not to prepare for someone else's arrival. I was doing them because I was here, and I mattered, and this space was mine. Later, I took a walk, just through the neighborhood. The sun had risen by then, spilling soft golden light over rooftops and dewy lawns. I passed houses I'd seen 100 times but never really noticed. I paused to watch a woman 2 blocks over hang linens on her balcony, her movements steady and unhurried. We exchanged a smile, brief but kind, and for a moment, I felt connected to something again. Not a person, not a family, but life itself. There was a park near the library I hadn't visited in years. I used to take my daughter there when she was young, back when she still reached for my hand without thinking. Back when I still believed that if I loved her enough, she'd never drift away. I walked past the empty swings, past the cracked fountain that used to thrill her every summer. I sat down on a bench that overlooked the little pond at the far end, where ducks once clustered and begged for crumbs. I sat there for a long time, not crying, not reminiscing, just breathing. And slowly, almost unwillingly, the memories returned. Not the big ones, not the milestones, but the small, invisible ones. Her sleeping against my chest in the back seat of the car on long drives. Her voice in the bath, making up songs about mermaids and clouds. The way she used to call me my mama when she was proud of me, when I baked something just right, or told her a bedtime story that made her giggle through the dark. Those moments didn't disappear. They were still in me. They always would be. But they no longer felt like evidence of something I'd lost. They felt like proof that I'd loved deeply, fully, and that love didn't make me weak. It didn't make me foolish. It made me real. I stood and walked slowly around the pond, letting the quiet settle in my chest like warmth. On my way home, I stopped by a small bookstore tucked between a florist and a laundromat. I hadn't noticed it before. Or maybe I had, but never thought I deserved the time to wander through its shelves. The bell above the door chimed softly as I entered. The woman behind the counter greeted me with a warm smile. Not too much, not intrusive, just gentle acknowledgement. I nodded and walked through the aisles, running my fingers across the spines. I picked up a worn paperback about solitude and healing, the kind of book I might have rolled my eyes at years ago. Now, it felt like a quiet answer. When I got home, I placed the book next to the painting. Two symbols. One for the woman who had lived too long in the margins, and one for the woman slowly writing herself back in. That night, before I went to bed, I wrote one more line in my journal. I am not a mistake to be corrected, or a burden to be managed. I am someone worth staying for, even if the only one staying is me. And that truth, finally spoken, carried me into sleep like a lullaby. The days that followed didn't feel triumphant. There was no sudden clarity, no swelling orchestra in the background, as I marched into a new life with fists clenched and eyes burning with resolve. Healing didn't look like that. At least not for me. It looked like standing in the shower too long, forehead pressed to the tile, letting the water rinse away a sadness I couldn't name. It looked like forgetting to eat breakfast, then remembering and making something simple, a soft-boiled egg and toast, because it mattered that I didn't keep abandoning myself. It looked like silence. Not the old kind, not the hollow void that used to feel like punishment. This silence was something else. It wrapped around me like a shawl, threadbare, but warm. In the quiet, I began to listen, not to what people expected of me, not to the voices that had lived in my head for years, but to myself. The part of me that had gone mute under all the caretaking, all the pleasing, all the trying so hard to earn a place that should have been mine without question. I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the way I was that night outside her door. Not in the car when I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. The anger had cooled into something sharper, something colder, something like acceptance. She had chosen who she wanted me to be, and I had finally stopped trying to convince her otherwise. There's a grief that comes with that. Quiet, deep, and almost impossible to explain. It isn't about missing someone's presence. It's about mourning the version of them that only ever existed in your hopes. The daughter I had in my memories, in my dreams, in the warmth of those early years, she was gone. And maybe she'd never been anything more than a collection of moments I'd wrapped in tenderness. That realization didn't make me cruel. It made me honest. One afternoon, a week after I came back from the storm and the doorstep, I opened the closet in the hallway and pulled out a box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were keepsakes, some hers, some mine, most forgotten. Drawings from her childhood, notes she once left under my pillow, pictures from school plays where I clapped the loudest in the front row. I sifted through them with trembling fingers, unsure of what I was trying to find. I stopped at a letter, folded neatly, no envelope, my handwriting. It wasn't addressed to anyone, but I knew immediately who it was meant for. I'd written it the night she left for college. I had sat on the edge of her empty bed, trying to hold myself together, and poured every aching ounce of love I had into those lines. I'm proud of you. I'll always be proud of you. And no matter how far you go, this will always be home. I ran my thumb over the words, the ink slightly smudged from tears I hadn't let her see. I tucked the letter back into the box, gently, and closed the lid. I didn't throw it out. I wasn't ready for that. But I didn't need to hold it as tightly anymore either. Some memories don't need to be preserved forever. Some can just rest. The next morning, I pulled out a blank canvas, bigger than the one I'd used before. I stretched it across the old easel I hadn't dusted off in years. There was no plan, no image in my mind, just color, just movement. I dipped the brush into crimson, then a shade of deep rust, and let it speak. Every stroke was a confession I never said aloud. Every smear of paint was a boundary I was finally willing to draw. By the time I stopped, my hands were stained, my chest hollowed and full at the same time. The painting wasn't beautiful, but it was mine, and it was true. I stepped back and stared at it. It looked like survival. I hung it in the hallway. Not in the back, not in a closet, but right where I'd see it every day. Right where I used to hang framed photos of us. Photos that now sat face down in drawers I no longer opened. That evening, I made tea. Jasmine, my favorite. I drank it slowly, letting the steam curl into my face like an old friend. The phone sat beside me, silent. I didn't expect it to ring. And I realized, for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't waiting. I wasn't waiting for a knock at the door. I wasn't waiting for an apology that would never come, or a version of her that might never exist. I wasn't frozen in some unfinished scene of my life, hoping the next act would make it all worthwhile. I was here, alone, whole, and I was done asking for a seat at a table that was never built for me. It was a Thursday when the letter arrived. Not a text, not an email. A real letter, creased from folding, ink slightly smudged at the corners. The kind of thing people don't send anymore unless they mean it, or unless they don't know how to say it out loud. The return address was hers, my daughter's. I stood at the counter for a long time, holding it in both hands, unmoving. The kettle whistled behind me, high and shrill, but I didn't turn it off. I just stared at the envelope, heart thudding too loud for a room so still. My fingers trembled, not from fear exactly, but from something older, something deeper, like grief recognizing its own name. Eventually, I opened it. There was no greeting, no dear mom, no warmth of familiarity to soften the paper's weight. Just a single paragraph. Short. Clinical. I'm sorry if I hurt you. That wasn't my intention. But I needed to have the kind of birthday that didn't feel heavy. I hope you can understand that. I read the words 3 times, then set the letter down. I stood in the kitchen while the kettle boiled dry, steam curling into the air like ghosts. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. Just breathed, slow and steady, like someone pulling a splinter from their own chest without flinching. That was it. Not, I miss you. Not, I wish you'd stayed. Just a justification dressed as an apology. I needed a birthday that didn't feel heavy. As if my presence, my love, my history, my sacrifices was weight. As if I were something she had to set down to breathe. As if my love had become an inconvenience. I sat down at the table, the letter still in front of me. A single slip of paper with enough silence between the lines to echo. I'd spent so long thinking maybe she didn't realize what she was doing. That maybe she was too caught up in her own life, too tangled in image and ambition to see the way I had folded myself smaller and smaller, just to fit into the tiny corner she'd left me. But no. She didn't want me there, not because she forgot, but because remembering me made something ache in her. And instead of sitting with that ache, she chose to erase me. I traced the edge of the letter with one finger, the paper coarse beneath my nail. I thought of the nights I stayed awake worrying about her safety, her future, her heart. The nights I prayed to a God I wasn't even sure I believed in, just in case he was listening. I thought of all the things I did without question, working extra shifts, skipping meals, pushing my own body to the limit, just to give her more than I ever had. And here it was, reduced to a birthday that was too heavy. I stood up, took the letter, folded it once more. Then I walked to the fireplace and lit a match. The flame caught quickly, eating the paper with the hunger of all the words I'd never said. I didn't watch it burn out. I didn't need to. I already knew what it said. Afterward, I opened the window. The sky was clouded, low and gray, but the breeze that blew through was cool and honest. It lifted the curtains like a breath. For the first time in days, I felt something close to peace. Not relief, not closure, but peace. The kind that comes when you stop hoping someone will come back different and start believing you'll be okay, even if they don't come back at all. I made tea again, fresh this time, not jasmine, but chamomile. Calming, steadying. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and sat by the window, letting the breeze settle into the bones of me, letting the past loosen its grip, letting the weight she didn't want to carry become something I no longer had to hold. She may never understand what she took from me that night, and I may never get the kind of apology that speaks to all the years of invisible giving. But I have this now. This room. This quiet. This space I no longer have to beg to belong in. I took a sip of tea and stared out at the wind weaving through the trees, and for the first time since that storm-washed night, I didn't feel like I was waiting. Not for her voice, not for her love, not even for understanding. I had survived the heartbreak of being uninvited, and now I was learning how to live with nothing but my own name in the room, and finding slowly that it was enough. 2 weeks passed. No more letters, no calls, not even a forwarded meme or a heart reaction to the photo I posted of the painting I'd made. Silence again. Only this time, it didn't hurt the way it used to. It wasn't a fresh wound. It was scar tissue. Still tender, yes, but no longer bleeding. I had begun to build something quiet in that silence. A routine. A rhythm. Mornings started with tea and soft music, piano or strings, nothing with words. I let the notes drift through the apartment while I painted, cleaned, or simply sat still. It amazed me how many hours I could spend now, doing nothing without guilt, threading itself into the moment. I used to measure days by how much I accomplished, how much I gave. Now I measured them by how deeply I could listen to myself without flinching. I started painting regularly. Not for anyone. Not to prove anything. Just because the brush in my hand felt like truth. I didn't care if it turned out beautiful. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes I tore the paper in frustration and threw it away. But the act of creating something with my own 2 hands, something that came from no one's expectations but my own, it felt like reclamation. Like every color I laid down was another inch of myself I was willing to take back. One morning, I walked to the library and checked out a book on grief. I didn't think it would apply. No one had died after all. But as I read, I realized, loss isn't always about death. Sometimes it's about finally accepting that what you hoped for will never come. That the person you kept reaching for is never going to reach back in the way you needed. And that hurts just the same. The book said grief is a process of letting go, not just of the person, but of the version of yourself that lived in connection with them. That hit harder than I wanted it to. Because that version of me, the one who showed up with cake in the rain, who smiled through being forgotten, who always took the seat no one else wanted, she was still fading. Slowly. Quietly. But she was fading. And something else was forming in her place. It happened gradually. The first time I said no to a neighbor who always assumed I'd watch her dog last minute. The day I didn't answer my daughter's text right away, just a simple, "Can you help me with something later?" And instead, took the afternoon for myself, walking the garden center and buying flowers I had no plan for. I planted them that weekend. Marigolds, lavender, a few scraggly violets I wasn't sure would make it. I dug my hands into the soil, felt the dirt wedge under my nails and the sun warm my neck. I whispered to the tiny roots as I tucked them in, as if they were mine to raise this time. And this time, I'd do it just for joy. That night, I slept better than I had in years. I dreamed of a kitchen filled with laughter, only it wasn't my daughter's. It was mine. Mine, and women I hadn't met yet. Strangers who somehow felt familiar, laughing, sewing, drinking tea from chipped mugs. I woke up with their voices still echoing softly in my ears, and something stirred inside me. Maybe it was time to reach out, not to the past, but to the future. I looked up the community center's website, the same one I used to pass on my way to pick up groceries, always thinking, maybe someday. There was a tab for volunteer-led workshops. I clicked it. The page asked, "Do you have a skill you'd like to share?" And my throat tightened. I did. I filled out the form before I could talk myself out of it. Crochet, beginner painting, creative journaling, small things, soft things. The kind of skills you think are too simple until you realize how many women have forgotten how to make anything for themselves. I submitted it, and for the first time in months, I felt something light bloom in my chest. Not hope for repair, not fantasy, just a simple, steady pulse of purpose. Later that week, I received an email from the center's coordinator. Her name was May, and she wrote with warmth. "We'd love to have you," she said, "especially someone who understands what it means to begin again." I stared at those words, begin again, until my vision blurred. I wasn't rebuilding the life I had. I was building something entirely new. And maybe this time, I wouldn't have to ask to be seen. Maybe this time, I would arrive as I was, and that would be enough. The room smelled like paint and old paper. I stood in the back of the community center's art room, heart pounding harder than it should have been. A stack of blank canvases sat on the table beside me, along with a small cup of mismatched paintbrushes I'd brought from home. They were old and a little frayed, but they'd been mine for years, and I couldn't bring myself to start with anything new. I needed something familiar in my hands, something that had already forgiven my mistakes. The chairs were arranged in a loose circle, no podium, no whiteboard. Just an open space where women could sit side by side, quietly figuring out how to begin again. May had given me a small sheet to fill out before the class. It asked for a title. I stared at the line for a long time before writing the words, "Art for the hands that have given too much." I didn't explain it. I didn't have to. May just smiled softly and said, "Perfect." Now the door creaked open behind me. A woman stepped inside, maybe mid-50s, wearing a blue scarf that looked like it had been tied and untied a dozen times. She glanced around, eyes cautious, then nodded politely before taking a seat near the window. Moments later, two more entered, one with silver hair tucked neatly into a braid, the other holding a canvas bag with nervous fingers. They came slowly, one by one. 8 women in total. All of them quiet at first, settling into their chairs like they were stepping into cold water. I recognized that feeling. I had lived in that stillness for years, the aching silence of women who had poured so much of themselves into others that they'd forgotten what it felt like to create something just for the joy of it. I cleared my throat, the sound soft and oddly fragile in the echo of the room. "Hi," I said, and my voice wavered slightly. "I'm Sylvia. I'm not here to teach you how to be artists. I'm just here to help you remember your hands." A few heads tilted. One woman looked down at her lap. "We use these hands to do everything," I continued. "We cook with them. We clean. We hold babies. We hold grief. We write checks. We button up other people's shirts. We hold the phone when it rings, and it's not the person we hoped it would be. We learn to do all of it quietly, carefully, and after a while, we forget that they were meant to create too." I reached into the bin and pulled out a brush. "So today, were going to paint. Not for anyone else. Not to hang on a wall. Just to see what it feels like again. To make a mess. To choose a color and not ask anyone's permission. For a moment, no one moved. Then the woman in the blue scarf let out the smallest breath, almost like a sigh of relief. Her hand reached forward, slow but deliberate, choosing a canvas. And then, like the tiniest tide shifting, the others followed. Soon, the room filled with the quiet sounds of brushes dipping into water, paint sliding against paper, soft murmurs as women asked for a shade or passed along a towel. There was no music, no structure, no expectation. Just creation. It was the gentlest thing I'd witnessed in years. I didn't paint. Not yet. I walked around, offering encouragement in whispers, sometimes just a nod or a hand on someone's shoulder. I watched as color bloomed across each canvas, some bold and erratic, some careful and barely there. Every stroke was a story, a memory, a reclamation. One woman, her name was Janet, painted a red circle over and over again. Not perfect ones. Some were crooked, some too large, some barely visible. When I passed by her seat, she looked up with tears clinging to her lashes. "I used to draw with my daughter," she whispered. "We'd make suns with smiling faces. She doesn't talk to me now. I don't know why." I didn't offer advice. I just sat down beside her and said, "Paint as many suns as you need." She smiled, shaky and raw, and kept going. Later, after the others had left, I stayed behind to clean the brushes. My hands were stained with blue and ochre, and I let the paint stay under my nails. I looked around the room, at the traces they'd left, wet canvases drying like silent declarations. For the first time in what felt like decades, I wasn't the only one speaking through color. May stepped into the room, her voice low. "You gave them something today." I shook my head. They gave it to themselves. I just opened the door. May walked over to the sink and picked up a canvas someone had left behind. It was mostly blank, except for one small violet flower in the corner. Barely formed, but blooming. "You'll come back next week?" she asked. I nodded. Every week. When I left the center, the sun had already begun to set. I walked slowly, the breeze soft against my cheek, carrying the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. I didn't think about my daughter. I didn't think about the door she closed. I thought about the 8 women who had walked through mine. And for the first time in a long while, I felt full. Not because someone gave me love, but because I had finally given it back, to myself, and to others who knew exactly what it meant to live unseen. The house felt different now, not louder, not fuller, but lived in, real. For years I had kept my home neat, organized, as if someone might come by and inspect it, comment on how well I'd kept things together. Like being tidy could somehow compensate for being forgotten. Like if the rooms were clean and the air smelled faintly of lavender, maybe the emptiness wouldn't echo so loudly. But lately, I'd stopped trying to curate my space into something palatable. I left teacups in the sink overnight. I draped half-finished scarves over the arm of the couch. I pinned dried flowers to the walls, let paintbrushes dry on the window ledge. The silence hadn't changed, but it no longer felt like a punishment. It felt like permission. On Sunday afternoon, I sat cross-legged on the living room floor, my old photo albums spread around me like stepping stones into another life. I hadn't touched them in years. I wasn't sure why I pulled them out now. Maybe because something inside me finally felt strong enough to look. Page after page, I flipped through time. Her baby pictures, her crooked first steps, her gap-toothed smile in the 2nd grade, her dance recitals, school projects, that one awful bowl haircut she insisted on getting in middle school, and always, me. just outside the frame, holding her coat, cheering in the crowd, taking the picture. For years I had thought that was what motherhood was supposed to be, loving from the sidelines, not asking to be seen, only to be needed. And when the needing stopped, I'd clung to the memories like proof that I had once been important. Now I saw something else. Not just absence, but evidence. That I had shown up, again and again, without applause, without reward. That my love was never a performance, it was quiet, unrelenting devotion. A devotion that deserved to be honored, even if she never said thank you. I closed the album gently, pressing my palm to the cover for a moment before setting it aside. That evening, I received an email from May. She said one of the women from the art group had asked if I would consider doing another workshop, this time on writing. Nothing formal, May wrote. Just a space where we could talk about memory, about how to put our stories into words. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keys. I hadn't thought of myself as someone who had stories to share. I'd always told myself I was ordinary, that my life was quiet, private, something not meant for telling. But maybe that was just another version of being invisible, another lie I'd accepted as truth. I replied, yes, I'd love to. I clicked send and sat there in the glow of the screen, my heart steady, my hands still. The idea of telling my story, not for pity, not for permission, but as an offering, filled me with a nervous sort of wonder. As if I were planting something deep in the soil, unsure if it would grow, but trusting that it needed to be there. Later that night, I sat down with my journal and began writing. Not just about the party I wasn't invited to, but about the woman I had become in the aftermath. I wrote about the road trip in the rain, about standing in that doorway soaked and small. I wrote about the motel room, the untouched cake, the hotel clerk who didn't ask questions. I wrote about what it meant to stay when no one thanked you for staying. I wrote about the anger that turned to clarity, the silence that became sanctuary, the grief that carved space for something new. And somewhere between the pages, I stopped writing like a woman who had been left behind and started writing like someone who had finally decided to leave, not out of bitterness, but out of love for herself. When I finished the entry, I leaned back in the chair, tears slipping down my cheeks in that quiet, reverent way grief demands. Not because I missed her, but because I was finally done waiting for her to remember me. I got up and went to the window. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, painting the road in soft amber. There were no fireworks, no miracles, just a stillness that felt whole. A single line from the journal stayed with me, echoing in my chest like a prayer. I was never invited. But I came anyway. I lived anyway. I loved anyway. And that, I thought, might be enough to begin a new chapter. Not in a book, not in a workshop, but in me. The writing workshop began on a Thursday. The community center had given us the smaller upstairs room this time, cozier, with slanted ceilings and a row of narrow windows that let in soft strips of afternoon light. There was no stage, no microphone, just a circle of worn armchairs and a table with a pot of tea, some sugar cubes, and a tin of shortbread cookies someone had brought from home. I arrived early, carrying a basket of notebooks and pens I'd bought myself. It felt strange, in a tender sort of way, to prepare for something not because I had to, but because I wanted to. There was no one to impress, no one to prove anything to. I had nothing polished to offer, just a heart that had been cracked open and a voice I was still learning how to use again. One by one, the women filed in. Janet with her ever-present knitting, Marisol who always smelled faintly of cinnamon, Helen who rarely spoke but never missed a class, and then others I hadn't met yet. New faces, tired eyes. You could always tell when someone was holding a story just under the surface. It was in their silence, The way they sat with their hands folded too tightly in their lap, as if afraid something might spill out if they loosened their grip. When we were all seated, I cleared my throat gently. "This isn't a class," I said. "It's a room, and sometimes that's all we need. A room to exist in. A place where the story isn't for anyone's approval." No one spoke, but I felt something shift, just slightly. A shoulder softening. A breath held too long, released. I pulled out a stack of paper and passed them around, each sheet holding the same prompt, written in my own handwriting. "Tell me about the thing you never got to say." Some stared at it like it was a puzzle. Others looked away immediately, blinking fast. No one asked for clarification. We all knew what it meant. For the first 10 minutes, the only sound in the room was the scratch of pens against paper and the occasional click of a teacup being set down. No one looked up. We were all deep inside the places we rarely visit, those unspoken rooms of regret, longing, guilt, love. The quiet wars no one ever sees. I didn't write. I sat and watched, my hands resting gently on my knees, heart pounding in rhythm with the silence. I didn't need to put my story on paper anymore. I was already living it. And right now, I was making space for others to do the same. After a while, Janet looked up. Her lips pressed into a line. Then, in a voice more whisper than sound, she said, "I wrote to my mother. She died before I could say sorry." Someone across the room exhaled audibly, not with judgment, but recognition. Marisol folded her page in half. "I wrote to myself," she said, "when I was 20. I told her she didn't ruin anything, that she did the best she could." That was when the tears started. Not loud, not frantic. Just a quiet river winding its way through the room, soaking the edges of pages and sleeves. One woman, maybe in her early 40s, said nothing at all. She simply reached into her purse and pulled out an ultrasound photo. She held it in both hands, as if afraid it might slip through her fingers, and nodded once. That was her story, and we received it without asking for more. In that little room, we became something else, not just women, not just strangers. We became witnesses to pain, to resilience, to the parts of each other that had long been dismissed or buried. When it was time to leave, no one rushed. We stayed a while longer, sipping lukewarm tea and folding our papers carefully. Some tucked them into their bags. Others left them behind on the table, as if they'd already said what needed saying. As I locked up and turned off the lights, I stood for a moment in the dark, letting the stillness wrap around me like a coat. There was something sacred in that room now. Not because we had fixed anything, but because we had told the truth. Walking home under the early evening sky, I passed the flower shop on the corner. I hadn't noticed it before. The display was simple: pale yellow roses, soft blue hydrangeas, a small sign that read, "For new beginnings." I went inside. I didn't ask the price. I didn't second-guess it. I just pointed to the roses and asked for 6. Back at home, I placed them in the vase that used to sit on the dining table when my daughter was young, the same one she once filled with dandelions and clover. I trimmed the stems carefully, arranging them not for anyone else, not to impress a guest, not for a picture, but because I wanted to look at something alive and blooming. I sat down beside them, the smell of fresh petals drifting through the room, and opened my journal. Today, I held space for others, I wrote. And in doing so, I held space for myself. I underlined the sentence twice. Then I set down the pen, folded my hands in my lap, and let the fullness of the day settle into me. This was not the life I had planned, but it was finally becoming the one I chose. The rain returned that night, soft at first, just a whisper against the windows, like the world breathing a little heavier in its sleep. I listened to it from bed, curled beneath the quilt I'd stitched together during the lonely winter after my divorce. Back then, the silence had felt endless. It stretched over the hours like fog, thick and suffocating. Now, it just sounded like weather. Not a storm, not a sign, just water falling where it needed to. I ran my fingers over the stitching at the edge of the blanket. The thread was uneven in places, sloppy even, but it held. Every corner, every patch, stitched together by a woman learning to make something whole again from what had been torn. I had no one to impress, no one to grade it. It kept me warm. That was enough. Somewhere in the early hours, I dreamed again. I was in my old kitchen, the one from the house I shared with her father. The wallpaper was peeling in the corners. The fridge hummed like it always used to. I was standing at the counter, icing a cake, lemon chiffon. The frosting was too thin. It slid over the edges like silk. I tried to thicken it, to make it hold. I worked carefully, methodically, trying not to ruin it. And then I heard her voice. "It's too much, Mom." I turned around, and there she was. Grown, polished, distant. "You always do too much." I looked down at the cake, now collapsed in the middle, the icing pooling at the base like tears. I opened my mouth to respond, to explain, but no words came. I woke with a start, my heart hammering in the dark. The rain had grown heavier. It pelted the roof now in steady waves. I sat up, wiping sweat from my temples, the taste of failure still sharp on my tongue. It was just a dream. But it wasn't. Because that was the story I'd told myself for years. That if I just did it right, if I just made it beautiful enough, if I gave enough, stayed quiet enough, loved hard enough, I'd be enough. But love like that isn't love. It's performance. And I wasn't a mother. I was an act she applauded when it suited her and silenced when it didn't. The next morning, I lit a candle before I made my tea. Just one, small and honey-scented. I let it burn while the kettle sang, while I watered my plants, while I stood at the sink and stared out the window at the rain-slick street. I thought about the women from the writing group, how they'd looked when they arrived, guarded, uncertain, eyes low, and how, slowly, each of them had begun to unfold. Their stories weren't always loud. Some came in fragments. Some were never spoken aloud at all. But I saw it, the way their hands steadied, the way their breath deepened, the way it felt to be witnessed. And I thought, maybe this is what motherhood was always supposed to be. Not control, not sacrifice to the point of disappearance, but presence, witnessing, creating space for someone to become. Maybe I didn't get to be that kind of mother for her. Maybe I tried too hard to protect, to please. Maybe she needed something I couldn't give. Or maybe she just never looked long enough to see that I had been there the whole time, holding the center of her world while the edges frayed. But I could still be that kind of mother now, to myself, to these women, to the parts of me I used to silence because they were inconvenient, or messy, or too much. I poured my tea and carried it to the living room, where the vase of yellow roses still sat on the table. Some of the petals had started to curl at the edges, soft and fading. I didn't replace them. I let them stay. Because even in their wilted state, they were beautiful. Even in their last stretch of bloom, they still reached toward the light. I sat and opened my notebook. Not the journal this time, the other one. The one where I wrote things meant to be shared. I turned to a blank page and began. There is no prize for being the quietest woman in the room. There is no trophy for holding everyone else together while you fall apart. There is only this: your breath, your story, your one small life begging to be lived fully, not for them, but for you. The words came easier now, not because the pain was gone, but because it no longer held the pen. I didn't know if my daughter would ever come back. I didn't know if she would ever look at me again and see more than weight, more than history. But I had finally stopped waiting at the door. And maybe, just maybe, I had started opening another one that led inward, one where I didn't need permission to enter. It was quiet the day I visited the ocean, not the kind of silence that wraps itself around you like a blanket, but the kind that stands just beside you, eyes open, waiting. The tide was low, and the sky was overcast, the horizon a soft blur where sea met sky with no hard line between them. I hadn't planned to drive to the coast. I'd woken up and simply knew I needed to go, like something inside me had turned its face toward the salt air and whispered, "Now." The drive was long, but familiar. I hadn't taken that route since before the divorce, before everything unraveled and then reshaped itself into the strange, quiet peace that was my life now. Back then, the ocean had felt too big, too indifferent. I remember sitting on the sand once, years ago, and crying into the wind, thinking it might carry some of the grief away. But the waves just kept moving, the same as always, back and forth, without apology. This time, I didn't expect comfort. I didn't expect anything. I parked near a bluff and walked down the narrow trail that led to the beach. It was mostly empty, just a few gulls perched on the rocks and a man far in the distance, walking his dog. The wind was sharp, but not cruel. I wrapped my scarf tighter around my neck and kept walking. The sand was damp beneath my shoes, cold and pliable. Every step left a mark that slowly softened behind me, until it was gone. I sat on a large driftwood log, the kind that looked as if it had been carved by time alone, smoothed by years of surrender. I didn't do anything for a long while. I just watched the water, the rhythm of the waves, the way they broke, dissolved, and returned. There was something brutal and beautiful about it, the relentless breaking, and yet, still coming back. I pulled out my journal from my bag. It was heavier than it looked now, filled with the ache and clarity of these past few months. Pages worn thin by tears and ink. I opened to a fresh page and stared at it, not knowing what I meant to write, only knowing I had to. I thought about her, not just the daughter she became, but the girl she once was. The child who used to sit on the kitchen floor, tracing cookie cutters through piles of flour just to hear me laugh. The one who made up songs about dandelions. The one who once told me, after a skinned knee and a popsicle, "I'm going to love you forever, Mommy." And then the years that followed. The ones that wore down the sharpness of that promise. The ones that shaped her into a woman who looked at me across a threshold and said, "You weren't invited." I let the wind take the sting of those words now. I let them belong to the ocean. There was nothing left to fix between us. Not because I didn't care, but because trying to fix it meant returning to a place where my worth depended on her recognition. And I couldn't live there anymore. I wrote, slowly. Today, I let go of the version of her who might have loved me better. I let go of the fantasy that one day she would look at me and see not burden, not history, not weight, but home. I let go of the hope that she will come knocking, hands open, heart softened, not out of anger, but because I deserve peace that doesn't hinge on someone else's awakening. The tears came softly, not in waves, in steady, quiet drops that slid down my cheeks and into the collar of my coat. The wind didn't dry them, it carried them, and I let it. I closed the journal and held it to my chest. My body, this body that had labored her into the world, held her through illness, chased her through playgrounds, pulled itself from bed in the darkest hours just to be what she needed. It was still mine. And for the first time in a long time, I thanked it. for staying, for trying, for never giving up on me, even when I had. I walked down to the shoreline, shoes in hand, cold water biting at my ankles. The ocean didn't care who I had been. It didn't care that I had once been uninvited. It didn't ask for apology or explanation. It just welcomed me as I was, like it did everything else that dared to reach it. I whispered into the wind, not a prayer, not a plea, just a truth. I am not broken because she could not love me the way I needed. I am whole because I finally chose to love myself anyway. The tide was rising, curling closer to my feet with every breath. I stood there, ankle deep in forgiveness. Not for her, but for me. For every year I spent begging to be seen. For every time I swallowed my pain to keep the peace. For every moment I made myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. I forgave the woman who waited too long. I forgave the woman who stayed too long. And I embraced the woman who walked away, without slamming the door, without burning the bridge. Just turned the handle, stepped into the night, and kept walking. Because the truth was this: there are some wounds that never fully close, some relationships that never find their way back. But healing doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like release. Sometimes it looks like standing at the edge of something vast and realizing you are not drowning, you are being carried. When I finally turned to leave, I didn't look back. The ocean would still be there, still breaking, still returning, just like me. I no longer wait for the phone to ring. I no longer flinch when I pass a bakery window and see a lemon cake in the display. I don't wonder if she remembers, if she feels the weight of what she said or didn't say. I don't rehearse the perfect response or replay that night in my head like a story I can rewrite if I just find the right words. That part of me, the woman standing in the rain, cake in her hands, hope clinging to her like a second skin, she's gone. Not in bitterness, not in anger, but in mercy. I gave her everything I had, and now I give what's left to myself. My days are smaller, simpler. There's tea in the mornings, art supplies cluttering the kitchen table, mismatched chairs gathered in a circle once a week where women speak softly and cry freely. I walk more. I listen more. I've learned to stop explaining myself. I've learned that healing isn't loud, it's steady. It's making dinner for one and still lighting a candle. It's folding laundry and smiling because the clothes are soft and warm and entirely your own. I don't need to be invited anymore, because I've built something that no longer waits for permission. There are still quiet nights, still old hurts that surface without warning. But now, I know how to meet them, not as a woman begging to be chosen, but as one who has already chosen herself. She may never come back, and if she does, she may still not see me. But I've stopped trying to be visible through someone else's eyes. I've stopped trying to be less than I am to make room for more than she's willing to give. And that, I think, is what survival really is. Not forgetting, but remembering who you were before you were asked to disappear. I am not the woman I was when I drove through that storm. I am not the woman who stood in that doorway, waiting to be welcomed. I am the woman who walked away. And this time, I walked toward myself. Thank you for being here. Her journey was heavy, but it led her back to herself. Watch another powerful story by clicking on the left, and don't forget to subscribe for more voices that deserve to be heard.